Thank you so much, Minister. Now we will have questions. So first of all, Krzysztof, then Mateusz. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Minister, for your remarks.
You should speak to the mic.
For your remarks, thank you very much.
Closer.
Closer, not. No.
Yeah, and have it closer.
No, closer.
Okay.
Okay.
So I was wondering on that last point, which you mentioned, that we need to show this directly how European Union and its projects is affecting people, but clearly there is this gap, and in terms of perceptions, the gap between what policy experts think is a success and what the people of Europe feel as their personal success, because the Hamiltonian moment, the Next Generation EU, the Recovery Fund, they were big steps in terms of policy expertise and what was managed to be done on the level of the EU member states and the governments. But I'm wondering if we will not resolve this problem of the lack of trust, of the lack of confidence of the people of Europe and the experts in the European project, as long as on the national level we do not address the issue of rising inequality. And we may have new railways, new projects, but as long as on the national levels, for no fault of the European Union itself, the inequalities will keep on rising, then all our efforts will necessarily be too weak, and then we see this lack of confidence, for example, in the vaccination policy, in other policies. It all trickles back to that. I wondered, what do you say to this national inequalities point?
So Mateusz, question from you, and then Minister, please respond to the two, and we'll have another round.
Yeah, if I could just add, because it very much builds on what Krzysztof have said. It is a very specific crisis when there's a wave, people need to stay at home. And even if one is not a fan of direct help, the envelopes with money, in general, the specificity of this crisis makes it perhaps worth considering, taken the above mentioned economic costs of, just to mention, 144 millions of estimated, as I understand, long COVID, people suffering from long COVID. So yeah, like my question would be, in Sisters Alessio Pecorario paper, an idea of additional income, taken how different this crisis is from other crises, was considered. Should, together with the arguments that Krzysztof raised, should it not make us reconsider some kind of additional provision for citizens, as citizens not mediated via business, as it was done in many countries, as Professor Grodzicki was saying in his introduction, which made a lot of especially vulnerable workers in the segmented labor market miss this help. It has not reached to the people who needed it the most. So that would be a kind of question from me. And thank you for an excellent presentation. Like, it was really uplifting.
Okay, so Minister, please respond, and then another round of questions.
Yes, challenging question. Is there a gap between what people think a successful policy is and what policymakers think a successful policy is? This is indeed a fundamental question. And for those who know me, that since over the last 20 years, I tried, when I was at the OECD, when I was president of the Italian Statistical Office and so on, to overcome the classical economic metrics like GDP it's clear that if we use that type of metric, the gap exists. But the good news is that the next generation EU is not built in terms of money. It's built in terms of outcome indicators, which means that, for example, in planning the railways, and this is what we have done as a unique ministry in Italy so far, but according to the European Commission also elsewhere, we have simulated the impact of all investments on transports and infrastructures on all 17 goals of the 2030 agenda, including inequalities. So I can tell you by heart that the indicator of the Gini coefficient of inequalities in terms of access to railways will decline by 38% thanks to the investments that we have designed. And the same applies with another number, of course, to the emission of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. What I'm trying to argue is that what the Commission will check is not whether we will spend money, is whether we will have a positive impact on people's life, finally, including inequalities, including the improvement of quality of air, quality of water, and so on. And therefore, and I'm an economist and the statisticians, you know me, at least some of you, we have to stop using just economic metrics, economic indicators, and move to quality of life indicators and design our policies in this perspective. I know that it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And Europe has all the indicators that would require to think and communicate in these ways. The other important element is the way in which the economic costs are counted. One of the two interventions was talking about this. Well, I would suggest to look at recent papers by very famous economists, which show clearly that the discount rates that are normally used to quantify economic costs of and benefits of interventions are dramatically wrong, because they do not take into account nonlinearities and thresholds. Therefore, you have a systematic underestimation of the costs of non-running policies against climate change. And the same applies to inequalities, because these elements are characterized by non-linearities, and our economic models are typically linear, and the discount rates are wrong. Let me conclude with a reference from one side to a recent report published, signed by Blanchard and Tirole, published recently, which clearly, finally, again, overcomes the idea that when you have an economic crisis, first of all, you look at the economic issues and push for a recovery, and then think about inequalities and environmental impacts. This is all.
Thank you, Minister. Now the second round of question, Monsignor Sorondo.
So, Minister, congratulations for your speech. I remember when you not was minister that speak very clear, and also as minister you speak clear, not so clear, but anyway, about climate change, I'd say. But I want to ask a very simple question. What is the problem of the drivers in England? Because really, it's incredible that all the Great Britain not have food, not have oil, not have nothing, because not have drivers. these are some relation with the European countries, the Brexit, for example. Thank you, Minister.
We'll have another question, Professor Giovannini.
Thank you, Enrico. Because Professor Giovannini now is, in order to enjoy himself, plays the role of minister, but he's an intellectual, he's a professor. So in that capacity, Enrico, how do you think that it is possible to arrive in Europe at a credible model of global governance? Because the problem still in front of us is that how to reconcile the internal governance rules of individual countries, which should take into consideration the historical metrics, et cetera, social norms of behavior, etc., with the uniformity of the rules that characterize global governance. According to you, what would you suggest to move a first step in the direction of making competitive? Because so far, the rules of governments of different countries are incompatible. And that explains why most of the time, the decisions taken at the European level are not implementable. Thank you, Enrico, and many wishes for your work.
Now, please, Minister, Professor, reply very briefly because we have still many questions pending and little time. So briefly, please.
Thank you very much. The first question is a great experience of how competition, wrong way of identifying competition, is much worse than cooperation. Is the idea that you can save yourself by yourself instead of cooperating with the others. And Brexit was one of the, let's say, decisions that was against cooperation. Maybe was necessary as a transition, but I think that now Brits show see very clearly the problem that the non-cooperative approach can produce, especially because the market doesn't fix all the problems, such the problem that you are talking about. Second, from Stefano, credible model. Well, I think that we are still in the middle of the crisis, and we see the problems that over the last few days, also in terms of important topics, countries are facing to find an agreement. One point, and I think that this is welcomed by you, Stefano, is that the advisors to ministers, without talking the ministers, were trained according to a theory which is now recognized as inappropriate or false. The 40 years of neoclassical solutions has had an incredible influence in the way of thinking of people who are now in power. Therefore, you cannot expect so quickly changes. And I conclude with one example. Maybe you have already discussed this. Why are center-right governments more inclined of neglecting climate change, of refusing the idea of the failure of the market, and so on, in managing climate change, while center-left governments are more inclined of recognizing this, eventually without being able to fix the problem. But I'm not talking about this now. It's because years ago, as you remember, Lord Nicholas Stern said the climate change or the climate crisis is the largest failure, historically speaking, of the market. And if you have built your life thinking that the markets fix everything, it's much more difficult for you to accept this Stern's sentence. While if you ever never thought that markets are designed or capable to fix all the problems, you are more inclined of accepting that sentence.
Right.
What I'm just saying is that we have to speed up the retraining, if I may use this word, of those who are in power, of those who advise, those who are in power, and accelerating the reshuffling of leaders in favor of people who have different ways of thinking.
Thank you. It's a great remark. Now we have 2 minutes left, so just very brief 10-20-second remarks. Please, Chiara, right? And Professor?
For in general.
Oh, you want to, okay. So the final remark.
Okay, so it's a very direct question because I really appreciated your sharing with us this idea of a framework based on resilience and future shocks. So I'm wondering if I got it right and if you agree, if we say that this kind of framework based on resilience can work only if we consider the impact of European policies on the rest of the world.
1 minute, please.
Well, not necessarily. What I mean is that the basic requirements for accepting that approach is that the future will be full of shocks due to European countries, non-European countries, climate change, pandemic, and so on and so forth, which is the opposite of what macroeconomics normally taught us, that shocks normally are temporary and linear. Therefore, that is, in my view, the basic requirement. And then, of course, like in the pandemic, we see that shocks can come from everywhere. Therefore, you are interested in building a resilient economy, societies, environment, and institutions everywhere in order to make even yourself more resilient to future shocks. I don't know if I well interpreted your question.
I hope that it was interpreted well. Yes, there is a nod. So thank you so much. Thanks to all panelists and to all the guests for participating. Now we're having a 30 minutes coffee break.
Good.
Please gather here. 5 p.m. we're starting the... Yes, after the coffee break. Now we're having a 30 minutes coffee break, 5 p.m. sharp. Please, let's gather because we already have a queue of voices for the general discussion. Thank you.